Well, welcome to another episode of ChurchPulse Weekly. It's Keri Nieuwhof here, along with David Kinnaman, president of the Barna Group. David, how are you? You are in fine form today.
Well, so are you, Carey. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. You know what? We haven't done a personal catch-up in a little while. What's going on in your life these days that's fun and exciting?
Well, I think as the seasons are winding down, it's nice to see the sort of the fall or the autumn, as you'd say, north of the border. And, we live in Southern California, so that just means the weather is just like 5 degrees cooler.
Right.
But we did have our first fire last night, which felt good. And my daughter was home from college for a couple days, and we were playing board games, and she was working on papers. And I'm looking forward to sort of the changing of the seasons. My birthday's actually on Christmas Day, so that's always a fun kind of run up to the holidays. And I like to joke that it sort of explains my Messiah complex. And my family knows all too well how true that seems to be. But anyway, we're doing well as a family, and just enjoying the seasons and enjoying the season of life.
Oh, that's a good place to be in, isn't it? That's really, really nice. Yeah. And it feels to me like we're maybe collectively catching our breath a tiny bit, just in the church, in our culture. I don't think we're quite into endemic yet, but it's getting closer and closer. And so it gives us a time to pause and reflect and really think about things at a deeper level. So we're going to talk a little bit about community involvement, global impact, and community care and outreach in today's interviews. In a few moments, I'll be introducing Keri Ladouceur and Katie Matsumoto Moore. But before we do that, I would love to get into some stats that you've been thinking about, David, as we think about what's ahead for us on the cusp of a new year.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think this idea of community impact and outreach, obviously the church has shown up in some really cool ways this last year and a half, ways that none of us predicted or expected. We've got some evidence that in a lot of ways Americans have sort of taken notice of the way the church has shown up. But also, real opportunities. And I think one of the big challenges will be like, how do we find, volunteers for the future, and how do people who are less in the building sort of stay, connected in with some of the ways the church can show up for the good of their community. So a few stats. The first is that 2 in 5 churchgoers, 40%, said they strongly agreed that their church offers opportunities to make a difference in their community. And I always think about, that's a pretty solid number. Strongly agree. There are another percent who say they somewhat agree. But 2 in 5, it's not a bad number, but how could we see that really grow? And it's such an important thing for younger generations, especially millennial and Gen Z Christians, to see their church show up with a real sensibility for community impact. It's one of the sort of the non-negotiables for young people, especially, is that their church is engaged in those ways.
I think having had the privilege of working with you over the last few years, David, that's one of the things that I am increasingly sensitive to. That, you have a stat like, okay, 40% of, but often now when you break things down according to generation, you would see that maybe boomers care more passionately about this or less passionately, and Gen Z and millennials are significantly skewed. So that is interesting, because I think I was out finally on the road speaking with some leaders and had face-to-face conversations. I was in Texas last week, and one of the conversations that came up is just generational differences. If you talk to older Gen X and boomers, you'd think like, oh, it could be 1998, but you talk to the next generation and all of a sudden you're in Portland or Seattle or something really left coast or progressive or whatever. And I think that's something to be sensitive to.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I think, in some of the generational differences, sometimes there can be real details missed, because, people are people, and you can have a boomer who's interested in a certain thing, or you can have a young person who's not interested in community outreach. And an important call out is people can tell us they're interested in a church that will do these things, and they actually don't show up in the ways that they say they want to. It's almost like this table stakes. They want to make sure you are an outreach-oriented, community-minded church, but then they may or may not actually give their time, money, and attention to it. But if you're not a community-oriented church, they won't even give you the time of day. And so I think it's important just to recognize some of those differences. And, we've been seeing this for a while, though, on a generational basis, for more than a decade, that millennials and Gen Z now are interested in faith being expressed in the world. One way we've come to summarize this is that they're not just interested in whether or not Christianity is true. They are interested in that, but they're also interested in whether Christianity is good for their communities, good for their friends, good for the world, good for the environment. Sort of like, is it true and good? And I believe that's something that's really important for us to keep in mind as we think about sort of an apologetic for this new generation.
Yeah, those are wise words, David. Anything else you want to share before we jump in with our guests?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Just a couple of quick stats. When we asked Christians what are the greatest problems facing the world's future, the top answers they gave were healthcare, providing food, and justice issues. And then when it came to U.S. adults generally, would they personally like to get involved with what kind of causes they'd be most interested in getting involved with? There's homeless services, companionship for the elderly, access to healthcare services. Again, those are things that sort of like people say they're interested in. Where does the rubber meet the road? That's a good question for us to ask. But again, going back to some of this work, we did a major study with World Vision a few years ago called The Connected Generation. We're doing one on global teens, and corruption and climate change. Obviously, the pandemic was such a huge disruption, but it triggered for a lot of young people these concerns that the world was sort of spinning out of control, and the kinds of things that they were interested in seeing the church show up for. It's like they want the church to be a laboratory for leadership and for addressing and solving deep and challenging problems, not just a place where you come and sit and sort of soak up the spirituality and go back out into the world. They actually want the church to be this laboratory for leadership development, for being turned into the kind of people they want to be, to sort of care for the poor and causes around them. So it's a pretty inspiring vision, and I think it leaves us as church leaders with a great opportunity of like, what kind of churches can we become that actually live up to the kinds of aspirations that I think not just young people, but especially young people are asking of the church.
Well, and I think it's true, too, that if you're growing up today, you've got access to information on any issue you want. Issues, whether, the mainstream media is tracking them or not. Whereas I think about my childhood, it's like, well, you kind of had what the media told you or your parents told you. So I think that kind of expectation for the church to be innovative and concerned and caring is understandable from a number of things. And fortunately, for the most part, it coincides with the biblical mission of church, which is wonderful.
Right, exactly.
Okay, well, why don't we bring our guests in then? Today, we are going to hear from Keri Ladouceur. She is currently serving as a community pastor at Community Christian Church in Naperville, Illinois. Before that, she pastored Vineyard Christian Church alongside her husband in Florence, Kentucky, as well as being on the senior leadership team at Willow Creek Community Church. She's also the founder of the New Ground Network and author of the book Together as a Team. And Katie Matsumoto Moore. She serves currently as the community pastor at Our City Church, a church plant in Corona, California. She also oversees life groups and Sunday morning experience teams and the city care team. Katie is also a content writer and breakout speaker at Orange. So welcome. Good to have you, Keri and Katie.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah.
Great to be
So, reaction to what David shared, some of the statistics, anything surprising, anything you're like, didn't think about it that way, or does that confirm what you're seeing as well?
I had a quick question, David. When
Yeah.
were these stats taken? Because as you're talking about healthcare as one of the greatest problems facing the future, I think the last couple of years have really brought that to the surface. So when was this taken?
That was collected in the May of 2021, so it's pretty
Okay.
new, just a few months old. Yeah, so it's been about a year plus outside the start of the pandemic, and I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that has shifted a lot of people's perspectives over the past couple years, and I think that's important now for us as the church to think about. Probably something we wouldn't have focused on a few years ago, but now it's at the forefront of everyone's mind. So I think that's important. I'm so thankful to have these statistics for the research that you do, and I think that's important. So for the church to be in line, I know this was Christians were asked this, but for the church to be in line with our world culture too, And so these are so helpful, I think, for us as the church to hear, but also just to be aware that Christians, and especially next generation, as you're talking about, are so much more connected to our world issues and the things that the world cares about, even outside of the church.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said.
Yeah, that's precisely where my mind went, was just how would these be different if we were polling people outside of the church? And so I was actually really glad to see like justice issues there. I even anticipated the healthcare one as kind of a part of equality. I was surprised climate change didn't come up in that list, but
I kind of thought we'd see that too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it shows up in lists when we ask young people about their greatest concerns for the world, teenagers, young adults. This particular set of data is really, kind of all U.S. adults or all practicing Christians in the U.S. And so when you have a broad base, climate change isn't quite as the motivator for older generations as it is for younger generations, as you might expect.
Well, and access, on earlier episodes of this podcast, I think a couple of our guests have raised the fact that access to healthcare and the unequal impact of the pandemic on different racial groups, different socioeconomic groups, really became evident that the cracks in the system are showing perhaps more than they did a couple years ago. So very perceptive, Katie, in terms of like, when was that taken? Yeah, that's fresh data. And maybe we see things now differently than we did a little while ago. So you both serve in the local church, one in Corona, California, another in the greater Chicago area. How are you thinking about the needs of your church community at this point as we near, it's hard to say out loud, but almost 2 years of the pandemic, which is crazy, right? Carey, why don't we start with you in Naperville, Chicagoland?
Sure. One of the things that we're really attentive to right now with the people within sort of the walls of our church is a lot of their mental health needs right now. There's continued to be a spike in conversations about resources around anxiety and depression and other things like that. That's one of the things we're attentive to is mental health. There's another one right now that's a kind of significant thing, at least within our community, is just people trying to ask some deeper questions about their faith right now. Like we're calling it Doubt Faithfully. How do we have a place for people to sort of go through some deconstruction and challenges of things that maybe have been a part of their faith tradition up to this point?
I was going to say, is that a response to a lot of the deconstruction conversation that's happening in the broader culture or church culture right now, Carey? Or
I wonder if part of it is that, and I do think the pandemic has it's given us the gift of illumination, and I think people are really wrestling with some of these deeper questions that they have, things they were handed that they're now sort of taking apart and being curious about.
So let's go to California. What are you sensing there? Man, there's probably a lot going on in your congregation. How old's your congregation, by the way, Katie?
We just celebrated 3 years in September. Yeah. Yes, but the first half was in person. The second half was online only. We meet at a high school, so we just got back in person this summer to kind of retrain volunteers, rebuild our teams, and we did a big celebration for our third birthday to like really reopen to the community. So it's been just a few weeks that we've been back in person and running services, and so it's been an interesting season for us.
Man, it's almost like starting a church twice, isn't it?
Yes, definitely, which is a blessing and has its own challenges, but we get to kind of take a fresh look, especially in light of what the last couple of years have looked like, and kind of restructure a lot of our systems and priorities. And I agree with what you were sharing, Carey, about mental health. That's been a huge issue that we have been aware of, and just trying to be more intentional in providing resources, of being on the lookout in conversations, and just being really intentional to be aware of what our people are experiencing as we're sharing things from the stage and in conversations and in small group communities. Another thing someone mentioned in the intro, I think, is what are the opportunities to participate that are safe, whether you are still digital only. There's a large part of our community who has not come back in person, like every church, but how do we create opportunities, especially in light of what we're talking about, to participate in community things with digital options, and then also in-person options. There are people who want both, and it's just a different perspective of creating, like, it's two churches, the online campus as well as the in-person campus, and it's two opportunities. How do you still participate online only as well as those that are ready in person. So it's definitely that idea of starting a church again, but also it's that shift in perspective of two different communities that we're serving now.
Yeah, if I can ask you about that, because that is
Mm-hmm.
interesting. You know, I've been pretty much in Canada, north of Toronto, for the last 19 months and started traveling just recently in the last month. So I was in Boston, New England, up in Maine. Then I was in Texas for a week, and we're heading off to Nashville shortly after recording this. What surprised me is even in open states like Texas, there are people who wear masks. Now, not a ton, but there were people wearing masks, and there were restaurants that asked you to put a mask on, even in Texas, which, you know, I was joking with the people I was meeting. They closed for 20 minutes and then reopened after the pandemic, right? Like that's basically Texas. And in Maine, it was even more of a checkerboard. If you were over 70, you were wearing a mask. Some stores required it, some didn't. What are you finding about the comfort level or even the experience of the people that you're serving with where we are in the pandemic at this point? Because what we see in the news and what's the reality on the ground is often very different.
That's a great question. I think so. I used to work in LA before I got married, and LA is its own world right now. They're very strict, and the regulations are so much, just more strict there. I think people are more cautious there because of that. I think on the other hand, where I live is in Riverside County, and there's just a mix. There's some people who have been very comfortable this whole time. There's a lot of people who are still only online, and it has surprised me the diversity of both. That it's not just the older generation that's staying home and online. There's some that are missing and wanting community, and we're the first ones back in person. And there's young people that have decided to stay online only, and so it's quite a mix. I think everyone has their own views on what the last couple of years have been, and I think
Yeah.
personal experiences too. Like it depends on your family context, and also working. What does work look like for you? And so I think there's just such a mix of experiences that has brought people to today and where we are today. But even amongst our church, there's such a push. I think, David, you were talking about earlier how there are values that young people have about a church, like being involved in the community, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll show up to that. And so there was this huge push for us to be back in person, I'm sure with every church. And then as we got back in person, there were less people than we thought. And so it's still like this mix. I think there's also not just like comfort level with the pandemic, but just almost like this complacency of like being used to staying home on a Sunday morning or staying home and having everything digital for you instead of going out to do things. So I think that's been an element that has kind of played into this too.
What are you seeing in Illinois, Keri?
Yeah, I was wondering if we were going to go there. We're under a mask mandate right now. Our governor ordered that, and so it's a mix where I think we have some locations that are more rural, and we have some locations of community that are closer to the city. And so even across our physical locations, we're seeing a difference in kind of how those communities want to engage the mask mandate. What's fascinating here in Naperville is I think we're one of the only churches that we're choosing to honor the mask mandate. So at least that's what I'm told. I don't go to other churches on Sunday, but I have other people who show up at our church and have said, for us, this isn't ideological. And I think there's a real leadership opportunity here for us to challenge people. It's theological to say, what does it mean to be inconvenienced for my neighbor? Or, we're even having conversations as a team around accessibility. Like if our mitigations leave specific people groups out or leave the vulnerable out, how are we called to engage this? So of course we have people in our community that are frustrated that we're following sort of the governor's, mandate and requesting people wear masks, and we're not like kicking anybody out if they don't either, but we are trying to lead out to say, here's the why. And I think that's so important because in this moment of so much polarization, when people don't understand the why, they make assumptions about that. So we're leaning into the masks at our location right now.
No, thanks for going there, because I think it's easy for and again, you only know what you know. And having traveled a little bit, you see the headlines, you see what you perceive on social media, and you get there and go, oh, wait a minute, the reality is a little more complicated and a little more complex than in my head what I imagined it would be. And what really surprised me in Texas, I mean, I was just staying in downtown Fort Worth and then in Dallas, was it was a lot of the younger 20-something leaders who were wearing masks, which was really kind of interesting. So let's talk about generational shifts. We hinted at it in the data, and these were broad cuts of the US population or Christians. But are you seeing generational differences in your ministries as to how the people that you're serving are expecting you to lead on certain social issues? Can you comment to that? Who wants to start?
Go ahead, Katie.
That's a great question. I think for our church specifically, excuse me, I had mentioned earlier before we were on camera that I lived in Orange County, and I think it's different from county to county where we are in Southern California. I think that goes to the population and the diversity in population too. I think there are a lot of younger families who were desiring community in person again. And I think going back to one of the statistics about companionship for the elderly, I think there was just a loneliness element there too. And so all politics, masks, all that side aside, I think there was in this past year or year and a half, however long it's been now, that there's the longing for community has shifted their priorities. And so I think a lot of that has been the push that we've seen to be back in person and whatnot, is that desire for community, which we offer digital options and still do, but it looks different and it feels different. I think we've all experienced that too. So I think that would be the generational differences that I've seen even in our small community here.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, we're seeing generational differences in all of these sort of hot topic conversations right now when it comes to racial dynamics, when it comes to climate change or accessibility, or even our part to play when it comes to justice. I think we're trying to be really intentional about how we articulate the invitation. And I'm finding that how we articulate the invitation is different generationally. And so for some of our older generations, it's reframing, I would call it maybe the fullness of the invitation of the gospel, right? In some way, we have sort of diluted our purpose is just salvation. Like we're going to get people across the line of faith, and then, what for all the implications of what that means. And so we're having to have a broader, more robust definition of a fully orbed gospel for people. And we're being really intentional about what language we use in that, and how we maybe compel some of the older generations to realize these are sort of core gospel things, that whether it's equality in our healthcare or accessibility to food, or, what biblical justice looks like, where the invitation is different for a generation, for 20 somethings, or for millennials or Gen Z. So yeah, I think there's lots of distinctives within that. And we're trying to step back and say, we used to talk about vision is helping people have discontent around where we are so that they want to move to where we're going. And so that, how do you create discontent, looks really different within those generations, but changing the invitation has helped.
Yeah, that's really good. Last night I had, just sort of shifting gears a little bit, I had my first choice to go see a movie in a theater. It was a little bit late. My brother was in town, and my son ended up going to see a late show of Dune, I guess it was. But I was like, I think I'm going to skip it. Mostly it was about the time of the day, but I haven't been to a theater in 19 months. And I've been saying to church leaders that it's not just the church that's been disrupted. It's theater operators, it's concerts, it's all the kind of places where human beings convene in a building or in a space. And so I'm curious, this long-term psychological impact of, like for me, it was about being a late night option, but it was also like, I don't know, maybe I'll just wait, because it's just so much easier. It's like, I'm wondering how you guys were thinking about framing the invitation to in-person worship, like you said just a few minutes ago, Katie, you the pressure to reopen and then people don't show up. And how are you thinking about the ways to talk about, the need to be together?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think something that we have tried really hard to do is create, they can't be the same opportunities, but very similar opportunities to connect for both communities, the online and in person. And we have tried to be very open in our language of like, if you're ready to be in person, we're ready for you. If you're not ready, we still have this incredible opportunity for you to join us online.
Yeah,
And
that's
we
good.
have built an online campus out of necessity through COVID, but that's we have said, even as we got back in person, like we're never going back to just in person. There will always be an online community and option. And even as we've launched life groups this season, and this season we've really pushed in-person life groups, but have a digital option as well for people, whether they're outside of our community geographically or within our community, and still prefer the online option. And so I think it's we want to be in person. We know that's something that people have desired and we've missed, but there's also options for community, even if it's not in person. And we all know that looks different. Even this conversation looks different, but we've also grown so much in what digital community and digital opportunities have looked like in the past year and a half that we probably didn't have or didn't think about prior to COVID. And so
Yeah.
it's the opportunities for both.
How about you, Keri?
Yeah, well, I think all of us would have said this is the trend that we've been on, right? Pre-pandemic, and the pandemic certainly expedited us in the direction of online engagement. And we're pivoting our entire sort of model and even how we began regathering, because we were closed for 51 weeks, almost an entire year that we didn't do in-person physical locations. It was all online. And even as we began to regather, we shifted the model to say, instead of one church and multiple locations, we want to be one church with multiple expressions. And that includes
Yeah,
online
that's good.
engagement. That includes some micro church expressions for people that may not feel comfortable gathering in that large group or may never walk through the doors of a church, right? People in our church are equipped to host this around their dinner table or in a variety of ways. And so we're trying to reimagine the model, and we were intentional to not diminish what was happening online. I know a lot of churches, when they began to gather in person, all of a sudden it's like, okay, now it's time for real church. And you're like, well, what have we been doing for the last year? Was that not real church before? So we have tried to intentionally point to some new ways to connect and to serve and to be in community with people, not just consume content.
Yeah.
I think we have to pay attention to the implications of this, David. And even with some of the new stuff that's happening with the metaverse right now, I just read somebody way smarter than me on Twitter talking about the church may be the one place down the road that people are fully embraced, not as they're projected to be, but as who they really are. And I just think the long-term implications of what's happening right now digitally, we have to be attentive to. And I think it's a great question you're asking.
Yeah, I love what you said, Carrie, about not just consuming content. I think that has also been a shift in what the church has looked like in the last year and a half. And something that we have, because we meet at a local high school, we weren't able to be in person. But how do we still be the church? That the church is not a building, it's a people. And instead of you coming to just receive, how do you go and be the church wherever you are, whether it's in your living room, whether it's in someone's backyard. We did watch parties for a little while in someone's backyard. And just what does that look like for you to go and not just rely on church leadership to walk you through your faith, but how do you personalize your faith, and how are you living out your faith wherever you are, and like wherever you are physically, but also wherever you are in light of just the spectrum of perspectives with COVID and everything like that. And so it was an opportunity to empower our church to be the church instead of go to a physical location, which we didn't have. And so we're like, but you are the church wherever you are in your living room. So how can you lead your family well in this? How can you lead your neighborhood well? How can you lead your community wherever you have influence to be the church?
I'd love to explore that a little bit more. And I'm glad to hear you say that, because we've hinted at, and I think every pastor listening to this can empathize. It's like, you better reopen. Oh yeah, now that you're reopened, we're not coming, right? So it's like, and they might not even tell you that, but they're just not showing up. But it also begs a bigger question. So a little editorial comment then. a question to you, surfing off what you just said, Katie. And it is, I think often for us, and having served as a lead pastor for 2 decades myself, it's easy to assume that participation in a building is engagement in the mission. In other words, you sat in a chair, which has a higher value in a lot of pastors' mind than sitting behind your computer or on your phone at your house when they can't see you in the building. I'm just saying that as a practitioner and recovering whatever. So there's that. But then there's, you really served when you showed up and you handed out programs, or you served kids ministry. And you guys know I have a big commitment to kids ministry and all that stuff that happens in the building. But it almost feels like engagement stops at the building. In other words, as long as you check the building boxes, everything's okay. And we're not seeing people flock back to church like we thought they would, right? Mm-hmm. That's been the almost universal experience. What are, surfing off what you were saying, Katie, some creative ways that you've been able to engage volunteers in the mission of the church, either in the building or perhaps way beyond that? Anything else you want to add to that? Or Carey, what are you trying out in Naperville? I'd just love to know.
Yeah, one of our core values is generosity. And so beyond tithing, we have something called Kingdom Builders, and it's giving beyond your tithe. And this is a lot of the community involvement that you talk about. So we have global partners, local partners. So we give to the world, our city, and our future. And one of the things that was really incredible throughout the pandemic is that our Kingdom Builder giving never changed. And so this is financial, and it's beyond the tithe. And so our giving, it was mostly digital already, was mostly online. But that was just an incredible thing to see about our community, that even though we were not in person, even though we didn't have the same opportunities for ministry that we did prior to that the generosity of our church to these world issues stayed the same and even grew a little bit. And so that like blew my mind, was something I was really proud of our community and was incredible to see.
Keri, are you experimenting in that area, getting more engagement?
Totally. And I mean, there's two probably everybody has done, creating opportunities for people to serve for the online experience, like in the chat room and doing prayer. And we've done a lot of prayer calls and just care calls for people in our congregation. So that's one way that we've kind of mobilized some people. But the other two things are our local community partnerships. We got really intentional about those. And several of them, one of them is an organization that helps people experiencing homelessness, but they have a fully orbed like legal system and job preparation system. And a couple of times during the pandemic, they hit sort of a lid and decided we're not going to just accept limited capacity or diminished care. We're just going to blow past whatever constraints and barriers we have to continue to care for more people. And so we directed a lot of our people within our church community there to do preparing meals and serving families that were a part of this kind of ministry that we're connected to within the community. The other one, and this might feel like it's out of left field, I don't know, but is some work that we're doing connected to racial reconciliation. And so both connected with some interfaith organizations here in Naperville, but also a program that we're engaged with called Undivided. And it's basically like an immersion experience that you do in a small group, but it's people of color, it's, Caucasian people, it's understanding the data and the history and the theology behind this. And I just shared with our lead team 2 weeks ago, I was on a plane and I was sitting next to a guy and he's like, what do you do? Oh, wait, you're a pastor? What? And it was totally like blowing up all of his mental constructs, just, I think because I'm a woman, but then we started talking about, what our church is like, because he was really thrown, like, what kind of church is this? And I was talking about Undivided, and he was not a Christ follower. And he just, at the end of our flight together, said, my friends and I, and even colleagues and I, are trying to figure out our work when it comes to racial unity in the world, and George Floyd and all these things. we feel the weight of. And he said, I just can't wrap my head around the fact that the church would actually be farther down the road on trying to figure this out than my buddies and I. So it was like, wait a minute. Like, I never anticipated this becoming an evangelistic thing, but it was compelling to him. And he got my phone number and he wants to join like on Undivided online and be a part of it. And so I think some of these things that we're talking about that young people in the church care about, I go back to, it's the invitation. It's what is the mission we're inviting people to be a part of? And does that require my leadership in the church to mobilize them? Or is that something, God's mission is going to mobilize them on, and I'm just here to give permission and equip them to do that. So yeah, those are some of the things we're doing now that I get excited about.
Wow. Well, I feel like we may need a round 2 at some point because I've got so many questions we didn't get to today, but the conversation's been rich. I don't know. I just have a sense that 2022 is going to feel different than 2021. You've both been part of fast growing churches. Carey, you've been part of a couple, and Katie, your church was doing great and then it's still doing great. Like you made 3 years. Like that's incredible for any church plant in normal conditions, let alone, the craziness that has been the last couple of years. Any things that you can think of that have helped your church reach more people in the past that you would be looking forward to trying to, pour some fuel on heading into a new year?
Yeah, that's awesome. One of the things, so our church is called Our City Church. The idea behind that is wherever we have an opportunity to plant a campus, it's your city and it's our city, our responsibility. And so one of our big things that we care about is local community. And so being a church plant has been really cool because we get to be involved in the local community. And I had mentioned before, Kellen and I just moved here about 7 months ago, but one of our priorities is to get involved with the city. And it's been incredible. We get to partner with them on something called Love Our City Days. And they do city cleanups and city events that we just come out in full force, provide volunteers for. And just things like visiting the mayor during her open office hours and just making her aware of like who our church is and, hey, how can we support you in whatever it is that you're doing? And so this next year, we're really excited for what is coming up just locally as we're back at a local high school back in person. But it's just built up a new excitement for reaching out to our community here.
Yeah, I would say, you asked about even the work with other churches. I think that part of this is what God's doing in my own heart to say, I don't want my investment in the local church to be about preserving something that was or is trying to be. I want to say, what does it look like to reorient this local church to be a part of the movement of God in the world? And I go back to the very core of, all of my coaching work and fastest growing church work is around like unity under mission and vision of the church. And we are God's strategy to accomplish his mission in the world. So it's not really about our mission. It's about what is his plan to redeem and restore the world and how do we get in alignment with that? And so I think being attentive to the gift of illumination that has come through the pandemic to say, what are the things God wants to reorient? Where is God working, or where is there darkness that he is calling us to be light and bring goodness and good news to people who are maybe more desperate for it in this moment than they ever have been in our lifetime. So I think being yielded to the move of God right now is a really exciting place to enter into 2022.
Well, Keri Ladouceur, Katie Matsumoto Moore, thank you so much for joining with us today. David, any thoughts as we wrap up?
Boy, what a fun interview. And just this idea of the church as a witness into the world, visiting the mayor's office, doing racial reconciliation conversations, trying to lead on these important areas is so inspiring. And as you said, Carey, I really feel like there's a real moment where the church is sort of entering into a new season. Mm-hmm. The exhaustion is still there. I think the sense of like all the old is sort of stripped back and stripped away. I keep spending a lot of time just meditating on Isaiah 43:19. Behold, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? And the Lord's just been ministering to me deeply on that. For my leadership, for my life, for a lot of things. But I feel like that's something for us as church leaders to spend time on. Like, where is God, making a way in the wilderness? Where is he asking us to meet? Human needs don't never change. But as you said, Carey, there's a real accentuation, a real desperation that I think certainly we as leaders feel. So why wouldn't others feel it about where they want to see God show up? And so let's let the church shine brightest in the days to come.
Well, grateful for all of your voices, and thank you so much for joining us today, Katie and Carey. Want to thank our partner too, Metashare. You can go to metashare.com/churchpulse to calculate your cost savings and see how much you could be saving on health insurance, which is an issue these days, as we've established, right, on the minds of a lot of people by switching to their services. So that's metashare.com/churchpulse. I've really appreciated your thinking and contribution to the dialogue. And if this episode has blessed you, share it with friends. Tag us on social. Let us know. Share it with some leaders you care about, with your team. And thank you so much for all of you who continue to serve and serve so courageously. And I'm sure we've all had thoughts about doing something different with our lives. But for all of you who have hung in, just want to say thank you. The church needs its best leaders right now. And we're so grateful that you're hanging in there and serving well. And we'll be back next time with a fresh episode. Thanks so much